Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. At the moment Europeans were crossing the Atlantic for the first time, the most powerful empire on Earth stayed exactly where it was. The Ottomans ruled the crossroads of global trade. Their armies dominated Europe's southeast. Their fleets controlled the seas that had mattered for centuries. They had money, manpower, and experience, and no obvious reason to chase rumors across an unknown ocean. While Spain and Portugal gambled everything on distant lands, the Ottomans made a different choice. They kept their attention on the world they already understood. That choice was not accidental, it was not hesitation, and it was not ignorance. It was a decision made from strength, and it would quietly shape why the Ottoman Empire never followed Europe into the Americas. In the early years of the 16th century, the Ottoman court in Istanbul governed an empire that appeared settled in its strength. Maps laid out before imperial officials showed a world whose most valuable regions were already known and largely secured. The empire's borders stretched across southeastern Europe, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean, enclosing the routes that connected three continents. From this vantage point, power did not feel speculative. It felt managed. Within the imperial council, decisions were shaped less by curiosity than by continuity. Administrators and military commanders evaluated the world in terms of fronts that could be defended, provinces that could be governed, and revenues that could be reliably collected. The empire had grown by mastering these calculations, not by venturing into the unknown. Stability was not inertia. It was the result of deliberate control. At the same time, fragmented reports circulated through European courts about lands beyond the Atlantic. These accounts reached Istanbul indirectly, filtered through rival states whose interests shaped how discoveries were described. They spoke of distant shores and unfamiliar peoples, but offered little that could be translated into the language of administration. There were no clear borders, no established polities, no predictable returns. For Ottoman decision-makers, this mattered. Expansion was never pursued simply because territory existed. It was pursued when conquest strengthened the empire's core, when new lands could be folded into existing systems of law, taxation, and military obligation. The Americas, as they were then understood, did not present themselves in those terms. They were distant, poorly defined, and disconnected from the empire's immediate concerns. Confidence reinforced caution. The Ottomans did not see themselves as reacting to European initiative. In military organization, legal structure, and imperial scale, they regarded their system as proven. European voyages westward appeared less as a new model of power than as an adaptation by states operating under constraints the Ottomans did not share. This perspective shaped how novelty was assessed. Change was measured by its capacity to disrupt what already worked. The Mediterranean world remained active, profitable, and central to global exchange. Nothing about the early Atlantic ventures suggested that this balance was about to be overturned. From within such a position, restraint did not feel like missed opportunity. It felt like disciplined governance. The empire entered the 16th century focused on managing a world it already controlled, rather than chasing one it did not yet understand. That orientation would quietly frame every choice that followed, including those that were never formally made. Ottoman naval power at this time was real, but it was also geographically grounded. Fleets were designed to operate in enclosed seas where supply lines were short and ports were familiar. The Mediterranean and Black Sea formed a controlled environment, shaped by decades of planning and experience. Power here was not about endurance across empty distances, but about presence where it mattered most. Moving westward changed that equation. The narrow passages of the Western Mediterranean were not neutral corridors, but contested spaces dominated by Spanish and Portuguese forces. These waters were watched, fortified, and politically charged. An Ottoman fleet attempting to pass through them would not be exploring. It would be signaling confrontation. This distinction mattered at the level of decision-making. Colonization across the Atlantic was not a single voyage, but a long-term commitment. It required repeated crossings, protected routes, and naval depth that could absorb losses without weakening other fronts. For Iberian states already positioned on the Atlantic, this was difficult enough. For the Ottomans, the challenge would begin before the ocean itself. Imperial planners understood that opening a western route would require sustained pressure against rival powers whose interests were directly threatened by Ottoman entry. Such a move would have expanded the empire's list of active adversaries at a time when its attention was already divided. Geography, in this sense, imposed political costs long before it offered strategic rewards. The question was not whether Ottoman ships could reach the Atlantic in theory. It was whether doing so served a purpose proportional to the effort required. Naval resources committed to forcing access in the West would be unavailable elsewhere, where Ottoman dominance still required constant maintenance. Seen from Istanbul, the Atlantic did not appear as open space waiting to be claimed. It appeared as a zone already claimed by others, entry into which demanded deliberate escalation. Without a clear reason to initiate that escalation, restraint followed naturally. Thus, the empire remained oriented toward seas where its presence reinforced stability rather than strained it. Geography did not forbid Atlantic expansion, but it ensured that such expansion would begin as a conflict, not an opportunity. That reality shaped how far Ottoman ambition was willing to extend. There was, in theory, another path beyond these Western barriers. Ottoman authority extended into the Red Sea, and imperial fleets were increasingly active in the Indian Ocean. From there, one could imagine a longer journey, south along the African coast, around its southern tip, and into the Atlantic beyond Iberian control. On parchment maps, this route appeared continuous. In practice, it represented a different kind of commitment. Sailing around Africa demanded endurance rather than proximity. Voyages stretched for months through unfamiliar waters, exposed crews to disease and storms, and required ships capable of surviving long periods without reliable resupply. European states accepted these risks because they were seeking something specific, a direct route to Asian trade that bypassed Ottoman-controlled corridors. For the Ottomans, that motivation did not exist. Ottoman operations in the Indian Ocean followed a defensive logic. They were aimed at protecting pilgrimage routes, securing access to the Red Sea, and countering Portuguese pressure near Arabia and the Persian Gulf. These efforts extended imperial authority outward from existing centers. Continuing farther south would have shifted the empire from defending known interests to pursuing uncertain ones. Even if such a voyage succeeded, its outcome remained unclear. Reaching the Atlantic by this route did not avoid rivalry with Spain and Portugal. Those powers already claimed vast portions of the ocean and the lands beyond it. An Ottoman arrival, regardless of direction, would have been met with resistance. The long route postponed confrontation, but did not remove it. Cost weighed heavily in this calculation. Ships sent on transoceanic journeys were ships unavailable for conflicts already underway. Ottoman planners were accustomed to measuring effort against visible return. The Atlantic offered no established trade to protect, no populations to administer, and no clear mechanism for transforming presence into revenue. Here, incentive mattered more than possibility. The empire already occupied a central position in global exchange. Asian goods moved toward Ottoman markets through routes it controlled. Investing heavily to reach markets that already depended on Ottoman intermediaries contradicted the logic of its economic system. European exploration expanded because necessity demanded it. Ottoman restraint followed from the opposite condition. Without pressure to escape their own position of strength, the empire found little reason to undertake a journey whose primary feature was uncertainty. Strategy followed need, and the Atlantic created none. The difference between Ottoman restraint and European expansion becomes clearer when the direction of pressure is reversed. European states moved toward the Atlantic not because it was obviously profitable, but because existing systems increasingly constrained them. Access to Asian goods, spices, textiles, luxury commodities flowed through routes controlled or influenced by the Ottoman Empire. Prices, availability, and political access were shaped by an imperial power they could not easily challenge on land. For Iberian monarchies, this dependence created a strategic problem. Royal finances and urban economies relied on trade they did not control. Atlantic exploration emerged as an attempt to build an alternative system, one that bypassed Ottoman territory entirely. Voyages westward were less about discovery than about escape from an established order. From the Ottoman perspective, this context mattered. European expansion did not appear as a universal lesson about the future of power. It looked like a response to a limitation the Ottomans themselves imposed. The very existence of Atlantic routes testified to the effectiveness of Ottoman dominance over traditional corridors of exchange. This shaped how reports of the Americas were understood. New lands across the ocean were not immediately interpreted as a rival center of wealth. They appeared as part of a European effort to reorganize trade on more favorable terms. The key question for Ottoman officials was whether these efforts threatened the systems that already sustained imperial strength. Initially, they did not. The Mediterranean remained dense with population, commerce, and political authority. Atlantic routes were fragile, expensive, and dependent on continuous state support. Early colonies consumed resources long before they produced returns. Nothing about them suggested an imminent displacement of established networks. Ottoman administrators evaluated power through revenue and stability. Measured by those standards, the Atlantic offered little reassurance. Existing trade remained predictable and profitable, while transatlantic ventures appeared uncertain and costly. The empire had no incentive to abandon a system that others were still struggling to escape. As long as the old world economy functioned, the Atlantic mattered most to those excluded from it. For the Ottomans, whose strength derived from centrality rather than access, the ocean represented a development to be observed, not a challenge demanding immediate response. That assessment, grounded in contemporary reality, reinforced a pattern of restraint that continued to shape imperial choices. Uncertainty shaped Ottoman caution as much as confidence did. In the early 16th century, the Americas were not yet understood as a stable or clearly valuable space. Information arrived unevenly, coastlines sketched without depth, reports colored by exaggeration, and claims filtered through European rivals whose political aims shaped what was emphasized or concealed. What reached Istanbul was suggestion rather than evidence. Ottoman expansion traditionally reduced uncertainty rather than embraced it. Conquered territories were absorbed into existing administrative systems where population, production, and taxation could be assessed with reasonable accuracy. Officials could calculate revenue, assign obligations, and anticipate resistance. The Americas, by contrast, offered no such clarity. There were no known states to incorporate, no established markets to regulate, and no predictable way to convert distance into authority. Early European colonies reinforced this impression. Many struggled simply to survive, consuming men and money without producing immediate returns. From afar, these settlements did not resemble the orderly expansion the Ottomans practiced. They looked provisional, dependent on continued support from distant capitals, and vulnerable to collapse. Even reports of precious metals failed to resolve this uncertainty. Gold and silver were rumored, but their scale and reliability were not yet apparent. Communication delays and political distortion made it difficult to separate reality from aspiration. Acting decisively on such partial knowledge would have required a willingness to gamble with imperial resources. Some within the empire considered whether preventing European rivals from exploiting the Americas might itself justify intervention. But this reasoning depended on foresight no one yet possessed. Denying access to distant lands of unclear value did not outweigh the demands of managing borders, rivals, and revenues that were already tangible. The Ottomans did not ignore change. They evaluated it conservatively. Stability reduced the need to speculate. When an empire's systems function effectively, risk appears optional rather than necessary. Uncertainty alone does not dictate restraint, but combined with confidence in existing structures, it makes caution a rational choice. As a result, the Americas remained an abstract consideration rather than a concrete objective. They were noted, discussed, and monitored, but not pursued. At this stage, restraint did not reflect hesitation. It reflected an empire acting according to the evidence it had within a world that still appeared stable and intelligible. While the Atlantic remained distant and undefined, the pressures shaping Ottoman strategy were immediate and visible. In the West, the empire confronted the Habsburg monarchy across Central Europe. Campaign seasons revolved around fortresses along the Danube, supply routes through the Balkans, and armies that had to be raised, paid, and maintained year after year. These were not abstract concerns. They were recurring tests of imperial capacity. At moments of decision, priorities became tangible. When resources were gathered for major campaigns, maps did not point toward oceans. They pointed toward Hungary, Vienna, and contested borderlands where failure carried political consequences. Victories secured prestige and stability. Setbacks invited challenge. Attention flowed naturally to where outcomes mattered most. To the east, conflict with the Safavid Empire imposed a different kind of pressure. This rivalry extended beyond territory into questions of religious authority and legitimacy. Campaigns in eastern Anatolia and Mesopotamia were costly and disruptive, but unavoidable. Control over these regions was central to maintaining imperial coherence, not an optional expansion. Southward, the empire's Arab provinces demanded protection of their own. These lands supported agriculture, pilgrimage, and access to the Red Sea. Portuguese naval activity in the Indian Ocean threatened established trade and religious routes, drawing Ottoman forces into long-distance maritime defense. Ships, crews, and administrators were already stretched across multiple theaters. Each of these fronts competed for the same resources. Imperial planning involved constant trade-offs, not unlimited expansion. Choosing to invest heavily in one direction meant accepting constraints elsewhere. The empire's leadership understood that power could be diluted as easily as it could be extended. In this context, the Americas offered no strategic relief. Colonies across the Atlantic could not secure European frontiers, counter the Safavids, or protect the Red Sea. Even success there would have taken years to translate into usable power. For an empire managing active conflicts, delayed returns held limited appeal. Restraint, then, was not passivity. It was prioritization shaped by necessity. The Ottomans did not weigh the Atlantic against inaction, but against wars already being fought and borders already under pressure. Faced with those choices, attention remained fixed on the fronts that defined imperial survival. Even so, the Atlantic did not exist entirely outside Ottoman awareness. From time to time, imperial officials and naval commanders considered whether access might be achieved indirectly, particularly through further consolidation in North Africa. If Ottoman authority could be extended westward to Morocco, the empire would gain an Atlantic coastline without immediately forcing passage through Iberian-controlled waters. On paper, this appeared to offer a quieter entry into a new maritime world. This idea aligned more closely with familiar patterns of expansion. Ottoman influence had already spread across much of the North African coast through a combination of military support, corsair activity, and negotiated allegiance. Cities such as Algiers and Tunis fit naturally into the empire's Mediterranean system. Morocco, however, presented a more complex challenge, with its own power structures and limited strategic urgency compared to other frontiers. Even if Morocco had been fully incorporated, an Atlantic coastline alone did not resolve the deeper problem. Ports did not automatically produce colonies, nor did access guarantee influence across an ocean. Sustained Atlantic engagement would still have required ships built for long-distance voyages, administrative systems capable of governing distant settlements, and a willingness to compete openly with European maritime powers already entrenched there. Within imperial deliberations, these ideas remained theoretical. They were acknowledged but rarely advanced beyond discussion. Ottoman strategy drew a clear distinction between what was conceivable and what was necessary. The former could be explored intellectually, the latter demanded immediate commitment of resources. The Atlantic rarely crossed that threshold. There was also a diplomatic calculus at work. Direct competition with Spain and Portugal risked widening conflicts at a time when the empire was already balancing relations across Europe and the Middle East. Ottoman policy often favored indirect pressure, supporting corsairs, exploiting rivalries, and leveraging geography over direct confrontation. These methods proved effective within the Mediterranean framework, but offered limited leverage across oceans. As a result, Atlantic access remained an option rather than a priority. Awareness did not translate into urgency. The Ottomans recognized the existence of another maritime sphere, but they did not see it as one that demanded immediate entry. In choosing not to act, they followed the logic that had guided earlier expansion: engage where power could be consolidated and avoid arenas where effort did not clearly translate into control. Behind these strategic calculations lay a deeper orientation toward how power was meant to operate. By the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had refined a model of governance built on law, hierarchy, and administrative regularity. Authority was exercised through institutions designed to produce order and predictability across vast territories. Stability was not a side effect of power. It was its primary expression. This institutional culture shaped how new possibilities were judged. Expansion was valuable when it could be absorbed into existing systems, when populations could be counted, taxed, and governed through known procedures. The empire had grown by mastering this process. Ventures that required improvisation far from established centers of control did not fit easily within that logic. European Atlantic powers operated under different constraints. Smaller states with limited access to traditional trade routes faced pressures that rewarded experimentation. Exploration was risky, often chaotic, and frequently unsuccessful, but it offered a chance to alter unfavorable conditions. This tolerance for uncertainty reflected necessity rather than superiority. From the Ottoman vantage point, such behavior did not signal a model to follow. It appeared as a response to weakness, not a path to durable strength. Ottoman adaptation focused on improving administration, military organization, and fiscal control within a known world. Innovation served consolidation, not speculative expansion. Success reinforced these assumptions. As long as revenues remained steady, provinces loyal, and armies effective, there was little incentive to depart from established practices. The empire's leaders saw no contradiction between strength and restraint. In their experience, disciplined governance produced reliable power. This difference in worldview mattered because it shaped perception. European expansion across the Atlantic unfolded outside the institutional rhythms the Ottomans trusted. It did not immediately register as a challenge to their system because it did not operate according to its rules. What could not be measured or administered remained peripheral. In this way, the Atlantic world developed alongside the Ottoman Empire rather than within its field of vision. Not because it was ignored, but because it did not yet intersect with the structures through which Ottoman power understood itself. That gap between systems would widen over time, even as each continued to function according to its own logic. For much of the 16th century, little in the Ottomans' immediate experience suggested that the center of global power was shifting. The Mediterranean remained dense with population, commerce, and political influence. Major ports continued to generate revenue, and established trade routes still carried the goods that sustained imperial finances. From Istanbul's perspective, this world showed no signs of imminent displacement. Early Atlantic developments did little to challenge that impression. European colonies were fragile and expensive, often struggling to maintain supply lines and internal order. Many required continuous intervention from their home states to survive. These settlements did not yet resemble the foundations of a durable alternative system. They appeared provisional, even precarious. The gradual influx of American silver followed a similar pattern of delayed clarity. Its effects moved slowly through European economies before reaching Ottoman markets. Inflation and monetary strain emerged unevenly, without immediately revealing their origins. The connection between distant mines and local disruption was neither obvious nor immediate. Ottoman leaders evaluated power through what could be directly observed. Armies continued to campaign effectively, diplomacy remained influential, and administrative structures held together a vast and diverse empire. Nothing in this experience suggested an urgent need to redirect attention toward a distant ocean. Large systems rarely perceive transformation at the moment it begins. The Mediterranean world had absorbed earlier shocks without losing centrality. There was no clear reason to assume that Atlantic activity, still limited in scale, would produce a fundamentally different outcome. As a result, Atlantic affairs were watched rather than prioritized. No single decision excluded the Ottomans from the Americas. Instead, a sequence of reasonable judgments reinforced existing commitments. Each choice aligned with the world as it appeared, not with the one that would eventually emerge. By the time the outlines of a new Atlantic-centered order became clearer, its foundations were already in place. Roots, institutions, and rivalries had solidified without Ottoman participation. What had once been distant possibility had quietly become established reality. By the time Atlantic expansion began to shape the wider balance of power, the conditions that had once allowed choice had narrowed. European states were no longer testing possibilities at the margins. They were constructing systems, colonial administrations, financial circuits, and naval infrastructures that reinforced themselves through repetition and scale. Participation now required sustained commitment against rivals who had already learned how to operate in this environment. For the Ottoman Empire, the question had subtly changed. What had once been a matter of whether engagement was necessary became a question of whether disruption was worth the cost. Entering the Atlantic system meant shifting attention away from regions where imperial authority was already established and effective, toward arenas far removed from the empire's administrative core. The risks were visible. The returns remained uncertain. What followed was not the result of a single decision or a moment of failure. It emerged from consistency. Ottoman strategy had long prioritized territories that could be governed, defended, and integrated within known institutional frameworks. This approach had produced stability, revenue, and longevity. It also meant that developments unfolding outside those frameworks remained secondary until they hardened into facts. The irony does not require emphasis. Choices that were rational within one world gradually positioned the empire outside another as it took shape. The Ottomans did not misunderstand their environment. They acted effectively within it, guided by pressures and incentives that were real at the time. There was never a declaration that the Americas did not matter. Instead, there was a sequence of judgments, each grounded in immediate necessity that collectively led elsewhere. Attention followed what demanded it most, and for decades the Atlantic did not. When the consequences of Atlantic-centered power became unavoidable, they were encountered as an external reality rather than a missed opportunity. By then, the structures that defined this new world were already established. Entry carried costs far higher than restraint ever had. In the end, the absence of Ottoman colonies in the Americas reflects the success of an imperial logic tuned to a different geography and a different rhythm of power. The empire remained focused on spaces where authority could be exercised with clarity and control. The Atlantic world grew beyond that horizon, shaped by needs the Ottomans never fully shared, and by the time its significance was clear, the moment for choosing had already passed.